Members, good morning. Welcome to today's subcommittee's meeting. This is the appointed time and we have a quorum. I call the meeting to order. We'll start with the first item of the agenda, meeting with the administration. First of all, we ask representatives of the administration to come in. Could you please ask them to come in? Thank you. And I'll ask the administration to take us through the paper. This is the Prohibition of Feeding of Wild Animals Notice 1999, Amendment Notice 2022. Thank you. The Prohibition of Feeding of Wild Animals Notice 1999, Amendment Notice 2022 seeks to expand the area of feeding ban to the entire territory of Hong Kong. So wild animals, in particular wild pigs, will not lose their ability to forage in the wild in order to strengthen the conservation of wild animals. Well, in terms of protection of public health and environmental hygiene, the FEHD in November launched new measures to launch operations to regularly capture wild pigs to stop them from appearing in public areas. Special operations will be taken upon receipt of reports of sighting of wild pigs in urban areas. The wild pigs will be captured and dealt with. Apart from these regular operations, we need to tackle the problem at its roots. Feeding is a main cause of problems of wild pigs causing nuisance. Once they've been fed, they would lose their nature to forage in the wild. Not only will they cause nuisance, they will also express aggressive behavior, posing threat to the general public. So we need to curb the activities of wild pigs in order to reduce a nuisance in the urban area. Under Cap 170, that is, Wild Animals Protection Ordinance, a person who feeds any wild animals at any place in Hong Kong inside the feeding ban area, once convicted, will be subject to a penalty of $10,000 of fine maximum. Currently, the feeding ban area targets mainly feeding of monkeys in particular areas. However, regarding feeding of wild animals, it is a problem that is over the entire territory and not confined to the feeding ban area. The AFCD is of the view that the feeding ban area should be expanded to the entire territory to tackle this problem. We think that our exercise of the expansion will effectively curb the activities of wild pigs. So we propose to expand the feeding ban area to the entire territory. This will take effect on the 31st of December 2022. With the expansion, the AFCD will make use of internal resources and based on a risk-based approach, mount enforcement actions. We're also working on amending the Wild Animals Protection Ordinance to enhance the penalty, and we also consider introducing fixed penalty system to handle work in order to effectively control wild pig nuisance. We'll focus our resources on the effectiveness using a risk-based approach. We'll be happy to answer questions in relation to this notice. Thank you. Well, I now open the floor for members to ask questions. I see that 8 members are in the queue. For the first round, I'll give you 4 minutes, question and answers included. I'll read out the names: Jeffrey Chan, Dennis Leung, Andrew Lam, Kenneth Lau, Stephen Ho, Perry Yiu, Benson Look, and Tony Zhe. First, Mr. Chen Hock-fung. I'm glad to hear from the administration that they want to tackle the problem at its roots. Feeding is a main cause for the proliferation of wild pig population, so I support the exercise. But I have some questions. The strength of your law enforcement action. What I'm concerned is that you might have introduced the law, but there is not enough enforcement actions. Well, there's plenty of examples, say, for example, littering. We still see littering everywhere in Hong Kong, even with the laws in place. How can you ensure that the legislative exercise will be effective? In some country parks, there are many people who would feed wild animals. So how do you ensure that these activities will be stopped? Could you enforce the law using a remote equipment? Say, for example, if you capture the image of someone feeding wild animals, then you take law enforcement action based on that. Well, given the current cleaning campaign, they make use of CCTV footage captured littering behavior or actions in rear alleys. Well, looking at wild pigeons, if you go to the old central public market, I'm sure you have been pulled on before. So if you do not deal with wild pigeons, I think that is another problem. Another point is, how do you define feeding? When it comes to law enforcement action, if someone drops something on the floor or put something down on the floor and the person says, I'm just feeding stray cats and dogs. So how do you define feeding wild animals? There are also people who even feed rodents or mice. So how do you make the decision before you take law enforcement action? Well, I'm sure that the member has been concerned about this problem for a very long time. I thank Mr. Chen Hock-fung for his questions. In relation to our strength of law enforcement actions, currently we adopt a risk-based approach and allocation of resources. If we expand the feeding ban area to the entire territory, we aim to tackle problems at black spots. So we will take law enforcement actions at these black spots. Internally, we have deployed manpower to enhance our law enforcement work. We have 32 colleagues responsible for wild pigs, and for management of monkeys, 17. In country parks, we have frontline staff members. They will be deployed. These about 150 people will be deployed to take law enforcement actions against illegal feeding in country parks. We think that this approach, that is, risk-based approach to target black spots, will make our actions effective. In the use of footage captured remotely, well, that is something that we do as well. So that is only used for monitoring and surveillance. Would you consider using the footage as a basis of prosecution? Yes, currently we use CCTV as a surveillance effort. We would look into whether we can use it for prosecution. We agree with what you said about wild pigeons. Under the ordinance, They are not domesticated animals, so they're not wild animals. Our expansion of the feeding ban area does not cover wild pigeons, but we're aware of the gravity of the problem of feeding wild pigeons. So we're looking into including feeding of wild pigeons into feeding ban. But we have to amend the Wild Animals Protection Ordinance, and this is not under the purview of this exercise. However, it is something that we're looking into, that is, to include feeding of wild pigeons in the feeding ban. And as to whether someone's feeding wild pigs or stray cats and dogs, well, the prohibition of feeding notice covers wild animals. We will look at the actual situation before we make a decision. We'll see whether the person's feeding wild pigs or stray cats and dogs, because what they do would be different. If they're feeding stray cats and dogs, then they would put the food down in a container, not just put the food down somewhere. And we will see if there are stray animals or wild pigs in a nearby area before we decide. Yes, I will monitor the time. I know that you have overrun. I ask members to save some time for the administration to answer. I'm sure there will be a second round. Next is Mr. Dennis Low. We look at Cap 170. In interpretation, it talks about animal. It means invertebrate animals, fish, or any animals in any shape or form. But here we're talking about prohibition of feeding of wild animals in places. Just now, the administration talked about domesticated pigeons. I don't know what's meant by domestication. Well, if I keep a chicken, sometimes if I keep a chick, sometimes it would go wild and attack me. And these animals might attack at times. Are they domesticated? So you need to use your words very carefully, because you can never domesticate an animal. When the wild nature takes over, and if they think they're a threat, they would attack, and they would be aggressive. You are empowered under the law that there is a penalty for feeding. Is under Section 18 is level 3 fine and $10,000. So have you actually used this piece of legislation to prosecute? Nuisance caused by wild animals is very serious. There are a lot of residential complexes that are being plagued by wild pigeons. But now there is this provision that says if you feed wild pigeons causing the place to be soiled, then you will be fined $1,500. It is a prosecution action not under this ordinance but some other legislation. How do you make use of this piece of legislation to tackle the problem? Say, for example, feeding of wild pigs, monkeys. What about bins of the FEHD that are not properly protected, and as a result, litter, rubbish go everywhere? Can you work with other departments to take law enforcement operations to tackle feeding of wild pigeons and other animals? Well, you need to resolve the problem. You need to protect public health and environmental hygiene. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lang's question. Regarding the Wild Animals Protection Ordinance, domesticated animals are interpreted in the ordinance. Actually, domesticated animals, well, they are changed by humans. For example, livestock are domesticated animals. However, when it comes to wild pigeons, they have been domesticated by humans. However, when wild pigeons are released into the wild, they proliferate in the wild, but then they still fall into the category of domesticated animals under Wild Animals Protection Ordinance. We will deal with wild pigeons, and in amending legislation, we will include it in the ordinance. In relation to penalties, in accordance with Wild Animals Protection Ordinance, feeding wild animals in non-feeding ban area, the penalty is $10,000. Over the last few years, we have prosecuted illegal feeding of wild animals. We prosecuted 111 cases last year. The penalty might not be up to $10,000, but then on average, the penalty is below $1,000, with the maximum penalty reaching $10,000. So we hope to enhance the deterrent effect, and we are looking at amending the Wild Animals Protection Ordinance by enhancing the penalty, thereby enhancing the deterrent effect. When it comes to wild pigeons causing environmental problems, indeed, feeding ban areas are actually limited to Kam-Chan Country Park, and it is not covering the entire territory of Hong Kong, and we will have to include wild pigeons in the future in order to solve the problem. When it comes to feeding wild pigeons, apart from the Wild Animals Protection Ordinance, FEHD will also invoke the Fixed Penalties Ordinance to prosecute illegal offenders. Thank you. The next one, Mr. Andrew Lam. Thank you, Chair. Following up on the questions asked by the other two members, let me be more concrete. First one, why have we not compiled a list of wild animals? When we talk about protecting wild animals and banning the feeding of wild animals, the purposes are actually different. So can a list of wild animals be clear in this regard? Can we have a clear list? Second, the criteria for enforcement. What I mean is that, as members asked just now, what is a feeding behavior? For example, if a person puts some food in a particular place, can you prosecute this person? This is what I'd like to know first. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Director. In relation to the enforcement criteria, thank you, Mr. Lam's question. Thank you for your question regarding the list of wild animals. Any animal other than those domesticated is a wild animal. Actually, the list can be very long because it will cover a lot of different animals, including insects, mammals, etc. So it is not easy to compile a list right now. For non-domesticated animals, wildlife animals is also covered. When it comes to fish and invertebrate animals, shrimps, crabs, etc., they are not covered. In relation to the criteria for enforcement, we will act in accordance with the evidence on the spot. For example, whether there is any wild animal present and did they eat this food, or the manner the food is placed. We will have regard to these circumstances before we would decide on whether the person breaches this offense. In the feeding ban area, these criteria are being used in relation to taking enforcement actions, and we have been very strict in this regard. If someone feeds monkeys, is it really the case, or the monkeys snatches food from these people? We will have regard to these factors before we would make a decision in relation to whether that person illegally feeds these animals. There are two perspectives. From a perspective of banning the illegal feeding, we will have to take strict enforcement actions. From a perspective of protecting the rights of the citizens, we are less strict. We are indeed lax. When someone puts down food, I'm not sure if there were authorities or examples in which you prosecuted these people. Instead of catching these people red-handed when someone feeds the animals on the spot, are there any circumstantial evidence with which you could prosecute the illegal offenders later on? Yes, this is an example. So what if a person puts down food? How would you deal with that? Thank you for Mr. Lam's question. In relation to real examples, we will have to take a look at each and every case. If someone puts down the food, goes away, these cases are actually rare. When someone feeds the animals, the person sees the animals and feeds the animals, and these cases are clearer. If someone puts down the food and then the animal comes to eat the food, these will be handled by the FEHD, invoking the fixed penalty ordinance. That is to say, littering offenses. Enforcement actions will be taken along this line. The next one, Mr. Kenneth Lau. Thank you, Chair. I support the expansion of the feeding ban area to the entire territory of Hong Kong in order to strengthen the illegal feeding of wild animals, in particular wild pigs, in order to prevent wild pigs from causing nuisance or attacking people. I mentioned expanding the feeding ban area to the entire territory of Hong Kong, and citizens will break the law easily, and the onus is on the government to explain to citizens clearly the list of wild animals. And please consider my proposal to compile a list of wild animals and step up publicity so as to prevent citizens from falling into these traps carelessly. Will the administration consider setting up key performance indicator (KPI) so that citizens will clearly understand the goal and the purpose of this, so that the whole community can monitor the effectiveness of this? Will video cameras be installed to assist in taking enforcement actions? This can also help prevent citizens from breaking the law. There are quite a lot of infrared video recorders, and probably you did not have a good understanding of the number of wild pigs. Will a regular monitoring system be established targeting the species of wild pigs and to carry out scientific studies? And based on an accurate estimate, only by then can you effectively curb these activities. Otherwise, it would still deteriorate. Can the administration tell us your thoughts? Thank you for Mr. Lau's question, and thank you, Chair. When we expand the feeding ban area to the entire territory of Hong Kong, so how can we make sure that citizens will not break the law when they feed stray cats or dogs? We will step up publicity in due course. Simply put, when someone feeds cats or dogs, that is to say domesticated animals, for example, cows, these are not covered. Feeding wild animals means feeding wild pigs, monkeys, or wild birds. Regarding the expansion of the feeding ban area, we will step up publicity as well as education. In relation to KPI, that is to say key performance indicator, we have already established a KPI in relation to wild pigs. That is to say, on an annual basis, the spots of wild pig presence, we will reduce these spots by half. 3 years later, we will review this purpose. This year, the black spots of wild pigs is 63. We have already conducted operation of capturing wild pigs. 34 of the 63 have already been well reduced. That is to say, 5 wild pigs have been reduced. There is no cases involving injury caused by the wild pigs. In relation to the estimation of wild pigs, we are using a statistical approach as well as an infrared red camera. We have taken reference from overseas approaches, that is to say the feces of wild pigs or the record of wild pig sightings. These methods may not be applicable in Hong Kong, as the estimate is not as accurate. Infrared video camera as well as statistical approaches prove to be the most accurate, and we will continue with the estimation in order to understand the number of wild pigs in Hong Kong. Regarding taking enforcement actions by way of a remote manner, we will follow up on this. The next one, Mr. Stephen Ho. Thank you, Chair. We welcome the government to take a step forward to expand the feeding ban area to the entire territory of Hong Kong. So there are a lot of loopholes, and we would like to know the timeline in this regard. If it is going to take 5 years, 7 years, or even a decade, can the citizens in Hong Kong put up with this rate? I have 3 questions in mind, but then now I have 4 questions. Having heard the question from my members, in relation to compiling a list of wild animals, it is difficult. But then in overseas countries, there are 3 types. Economy animals, that is to say livestock, pig, cow, etc. Of course, you can include pigeons as well. Second, wild animals, which I will not delve into it. 3, that is to say pets, companion animals. If wild pig are listed under wild animals, this will help citizens to understand how the law sees this, and the law will also be more complete. For example, we will improve the Wild Animals Protection Ordinance. If we adopt 3 different approaches, whether it be to the trade or to citizens, this will have a positive impact as well. Second, in relation to KPI mentioned by Mr. Kenneth Lau, black spots are actually recognized by the government, but then I think that the definition is not that accurate. There are actually a lot of black spots in the new territories, and there are samples of African swine fever as well. And this will cause a devastating impact on the livestock trade. And I think that this is a black spot indeed, but then it is not included by the government in the list. I hope the government can follow up on this. 3, regarding allocating more resources. Well, there used to be no officers there, and if you have to expand the feeding ban area to the entire territory of Hong Kong, will you join hands with other departments? Will you work with the police force or the FEHD? Are these departments willing to shoulder these responsibilities? When police officers issue penalty tickets, will the process by streamlining their enforcement actions, will the tickets be provided to them? In relation to the manner by which animals are fed, there are different feeding methods in relation to different animals, but then humans can actually vary the methods. When you open a plastic bag and feed dogs with animals inside the bag, I can actually feed wild pigs with the same manner. When someone walks and someone drops some food onto the ground, you can say that that person is polluting the environment, but then it is difficult from the perspective of the court systems that that person is feeding pigeons. And in this regard, I think that evidence is insufficient. Can you be clear if the end result is that when wild pigs or wild animals consume the food provided by the person, then this would amount to an offense?
Let's hear from the director. I thank the member for the questions. Regarding wild pigeons, we're looking into the inclusion of wild pigeons under the law, but we need to amend the principal legislation, that is the Wild Animals Protection Ordinance. We have already started the study. We reckon that next year we will be able to introduce the legislative amendment. We're doing it phase by phase. We'll start with the expansion of the feeding ban area. Next year, we will amend the law to include wild pigeons. We'll also enhance penalty. On top of that, we will introduce a fixed penalty system. This will make law enforcement actions easier. Just now, a member talked about law enforcement actions. We will use internal resources. We'll talk to relevant departments, say, for example, the FEHD, to see that after the enhancement of penalty and the introduction of fixed penalty system, for departments to simply issue a fixed penalty ticket. About black spots, our definition are based on 2 criteria. More than 5 wild pigs are sighted, causing nuisance, or places where there has been attack. We are aware that, yes, wild pigs may cause nuisance in rural areas. It's not the case that we don't do anything. If wild pigs cause damage to farmland or posing safety hazards in rural areas, we will also take action. Member also mentioned about evidence. There are many different ways to produce or to gather evidence. It depends on the case. If we have any questions, we will seek legal advice. For obvious feeding cases, you can tell. For less obvious cases, if someone simply put the food down, then we will see whether we can use, which piece of legislation to take action. Well, I'll ask this question and I won't have any more questions. When the KPI doesn't cover rural areas, law enforcement officers will find it difficult to decide what to do. I suggest that you will work with people from the rural area, from Mr. Kenneth Lau, to see what you can do in rural areas. Next, Mr. Perry Yu. I support the expansion of the feeding ban area to the entire territory. Questions have been asked by members, and I have some. First, how do you ensure effective law enforcement action? Just now, the administration said that there is a team of 32 people tackling wild pigs and 17 on monkeys. And there are 60 or so black spots, so each will be covered by 2 people. If the area is expanded to the entire territory, we don't know how many more black spots there will be. Some members mentioned about making use of technology to enable law enforcement actions. You need to consider that. We can't allow you a limitless increase in manpower after the expansion. So how do you ensure that with the expansion you can effectively carry out law enforcement actions? How do you let the public know about this change? Are you going to enhance your publicity and education? Will you distribute leaflets? We've never seen anything like this at black spots. Would you produce banners, publicity materials? I think you can include public education and publicity in your KPIs as well. Well, apart from rural areas and country parks, I think the problem in urban areas is the feeding of wild pigs and birds. We're aware of hygiene problems, environmental hygiene problems caused by people feeding birds. And this in turn causes rodent problems. There is a lack of cross-district action. The housing department will take care of problems in public housing estates. And there are areas that are under the purview of the AFCD or the FEHD. But is there a clear mechanism in place to make sure that someone is in charge of a certain area or location on top of publicity and public education? So let's hear from the director. Thank you. As I said, we have a dedicated team to tackle wild pig problems. That includes capturing and other issues. As I said, we will mobilize other teams, including those in charge of country parks, to take law enforcement actions. We work with other departments to mount joint operations, and we'll explore with them as to how we can do it better. After we have introduced the fixed penalty system, we will work out ways to make our law enforcement actions more effective. The suggestion of using technology is a very welcome suggestion. We're working on how to make use of technology, say, for example, video recording to help us. With the expansion of the feeding ban area, we will enhance our publicity campaign targeting black spots. There are already banners asking people not to feed wild animals. We will step up our publicity, asking members of the public not to feed wild animals. We also take the initiative to carry out public education. We ask contractors to launch campaigns to teach members of the public not to feed wild animals by telling them the problems caused by such actions. Yes, wild pigeons is a problem. We're now actively looking into including wild pigeons in the ordinance so that feeding of wild pigeons will be prohibited. We are aware of the problems, hygiene problems and public health hazards posed by wild pigeons. Next, Mr. Benson Look. Thank you. I'm glad to hear that the administration has taken a step forward. I have some questions to ask. First, reports. The administration explained that, prosecution action can only take place after evidence has been gathered when they are aware of feeding cases at a certain black spots. I think it's very different from littering because when someone's spotted to have dump rubbish or litter, then you can take law enforcement action. It's not like feeding a goat in a petting zoo. So the prosecution is difficult. A paper tiger does not scare wild pigs. So can you explain to us how you can ensure successful prosecution? What we don't want is that we're under the illusion that when we have the law, the problem is resolved. You want to change the behavior of wild pigs because in the first place, feeding of wild pigs by humans has changed their behavior. Does the expansion of the ban change the behavior back to being able to forage in the wild? I do not support culling. Trap neuter release does not seem to be very effective. Will the administration consider other alternatives? Say, for example, a system to scare them away, like the device put on airplanes and airports to scare birds away. In paragraph of your paper, you mentioned about a special permit. It is in paragraph 7. It says that a person who does not hold a special permit when they feed wild animals breaks the law. So what is this special permit about? If someone applies for a special permit, and how do you, based on what would you approve the application? I thank the member for his questions. Regarding prosecution, yes, indeed, under the law, if for us to prove that someone feeds a wild animal, then we need to gather sufficient evidence before we can initiate prosecution. But as I said, that we're working on amending the law to do it by way of summons, just like littering. We believe that with that system in place, it will be easier for us to initiate prosecution actions. Currently, it is more difficult. We are adopting a two-pronged approach. We want to enhance the deterrence effect and at the same time makes our law enforcement actions more effective. Regarding feeding of wild pigs, we see that if the feeding stops, when people stop feeding wild pigs, majority of the wild pigs will go back to the wild to find food. So the most important thing is for people to stop feeding them. When wild pigs no longer cause nuisance, then the problem is resolved. And if the feeding continues, and if wild pigs are used to getting fed, and if they cause safety hazards, then we will capture them and deal with them in a humane way. For the special permit, under the law, we issue special permits for people to feed wild animals in feeding ban area, but it's not just issued to anyone. There are groups, say for example the Kadori farm, they have special operations to help wild animals. We issue them with a special permit. And for the Ocean Park, there is a program. It's a neutering program of monkeys. So they need to feed wild monkeys to capture them. But for just a member of public, if they want to feed wild animals or birds, then we will not issue them with a special permit. Thank you.
係啊，謝偉全議員唔該。
Next, Mr. Tony Tse. Thank you, Chair. We are scrutinizing the proposal today to amend the notice. That is to say, to expand the feeding ban area to the entire territory of Hong Kong. The government representative just now said that in accordance with common law, the definition of wild animals, although we are talking about wild pigs in the document, the administration explained that they are working on a host of things. In relation to the notice, there is an urgency because it covers all wild animals right now. At most, we include wild pigeons and monkeys as well. This is of urgency because otherwise we would like to make holistic improvements. When we talk about wild pigs, it started in 2017. And in late 2021, there was a different method. The neutering program did not bear fruit, and that took several years. And I do not want citizens to be laboring under the impression that you work on things just because there is a sense of urgency. So when we are still scrutinizing the proposal, we should do this in a comprehensive manner. So why are we just targeting wild pigs? If this is of concern to you, this is the first point. Because you cover all wild animals. So what about manpower? In relation to internal resource deployment, since this amendment notice must have more resources allocated, because you are not making an application to the electrical. Indeed, you are making arrangements internally. So we are concerned whether you are really targeting wild pigs only, and you are not dealing with other animals at this stage, because this will come into operation on the 31st of December this year. I do not quite understand the logic. If you say that this is urgent, then I would not pursue. If you say that this is urgent, and we should deal with wild pigs, then you should really target wild pigs. And simply put, the coverage of all wild animals. It's a different matter, and you think that amending this notice is rather simple, and you would like an earlier implementation. When this comes into operation, people will say that what about monkeys? There are definitions legally, but then you cannot amend the definitions right now, and this would cause confusion. And you have to tell citizens the reasons behind. In relation to increasing manpower, so what is the exact figure? Thank you, Chair. Director has the floor. Thank you, member, for the question. We think that this is of urgency to issue a notice to expand the feeding ban area to the entire territory of Hong Kong. On the last occasion, in the panel on environmental affairs, it was mentioned that basically wild pig nuisance is serious. The major reason being illegal feeding, and this is scattered across the entire territory of Hong Kong, unlike monkeys, which are centrally distributed in Kam Shan and Sheng Mun. In relation to the feeding problem, if we do not resolve the problem, the wild pig nuisance problem cannot be resolved at its roots only by capture operations. So our suggestion is that for the first step to expand the feeding ban area to the entire territory of Hong Kong. And the next step we would take is in relation to the penalty and the fixed penalty. We will enhance it and we will also introduce it to the offense. And then we can more holistically resolve the problem of illegal feeding. We are adopting a multi-pronged approach to addressing problems in relation to wild animals, for example, nuisance. When it comes to manpower, at the moment we are still mobilizing resources we have right now. That is to say, we target black spots. In the future, when the penalty is increased, and when the fixed penalty is introduced, we believe that law enforcement will become more effective in the future. And this will also increase the deterrent effect as well. From different perspectives, we are resolving the problem of illegal feeding efficiently. So what is the timeline for your future plan? Otherwise, you can simply expand the feeding ban area and limit it to wild pigs. If you are saying that there is no increase in manpower, and you are just targeting wild pigs right now, if the coverage is all wild animals, and you have plans of increasing the penalty, is there actually a timeline? If you are just targeting wild pigs, and you also mention wild pigeons, so when will the fixed penalty come into operation? Probably 3 months later. There is future work, and I hope that I will have these pieces of information supplemented. You mentioned next year, Director. Do you have a more specific timeline? Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members, for your question. Our plan right now is that for this year, we will amend the notice to expand the feeding ban area to the entire territory of Hong Kong. And we are laying the groundworks for the amendment of the Wild Animals Protection Ordinance, and we are targeting amending the legislation next year. By the end of 2023, we are expecting that the legislative amendments could be completed so that the penalty will be increased and the fixed penalty will also be introduced. In relation to the wild pigs problem, this is the most important, especially when it comes to illegal feeding. And in relation to the amendment to the wild animals notice, actually other animals are covered as well. The illegal feeding of monkeys and other animals is seen across the territory. And for monkeys, they are mostly found in Kam, Shan, and Shengmun. For wild pigeons or even other kinds of birds, there is illegal feeding across the territory. So we have to ban the illegal feeding of these animals by virtue of this amendment. And myself, having heard the explanations offered by the authorities as well as some questions mentioned by the members, we are of the opinion that this legislative amendment is just a small step forward, but then there is a long way to go in the future. Looking ahead, there are at least 3 matters we are anticipating. First, we have to include wild pigeons in the ordinance. Second, the increase in penalty. Third, the introduction of a fixed penalty. These 3 matters are what the members are expecting you to commence work in this regard, and not only timeline, but actual work. The second suggestion I have is that having heard the explanations, if we only talk about wild pigs, the number is 32 colleagues who are responsible for this line of work. But then when we have to expand the area to the entire territory of Hong Kong to enhance the deterrent effect, just this manpower alone and the internal resource deployment, can you really cope? And I believe that this is close to the heart of the members today. Regarding the illegal feeding of wild pigeons, the reason why members are concerned about this is that this was actually mentioned previously, and we see eye to eye in relation to the amendment of the ordinance. But unfortunately, this is not included on this occasion, and you said that you would work on it. The illegal feeding of wild pigeons causes nuisance to all people across the territory, and it also poses grave hygiene problems. If you have to include the wild pigeons, and if you would like to take enforcement actions in this regard, how many officers or manpower in general will you include? If you think that dozens of officers would be sufficient to cope, I'm afraid that members would find it difficult to believe that such an amount of manpower could cope with this plan. And do you have the figures in relation to prosecutions initiated in relation to the legal feeding of wild pigeons? This is my question.
Acting Assistant Director. This amendment notice is to amend Cap 170B by way of negative vetting, which is the most speedy approach. That's why we use this to expand the feeding ban area. If we are to include wild pigeons under the prohibition, if we are to also include the enhancement of penalty as well as the fixed penalty, we have to amend the principal legislation. It will take time. That's why we have taken this approach to first expand the feeding ban area. We want to first tackle nuisance caused by wild pigs at its roots. For manpower, we don't have any breakdown in relation to wild pigeons. Well, for feeding ban areas, it covers Shingmun and Kamshan. It's more about monkeys. And as to whether wild pigeons would have eaten the food, we don't have any breakdown of figures. Currently, we use fixed penalty of $1,500 under the FEHD regarding nuisance caused by wild pigeons. With the expansion of the area, we will internally mobilize manpower and allocate resources. If we are to include wild pigeons, we will work with the FEHD to find ways to carry out law enforcement actions. It's not just us. It's not just the dozens of us to do that. Sorry, just one quick question. Prosecution by FEHD on feeding of wild pigeons, do you have the figures? 1,500 fine. We don't have the figure at hand. Could you please supply the information to us after the meeting? Because members, I'm sure, would like to know. Yes. Next, Reverend Kuhn. Thank you. I do understand that because of the situation in Hong Kong, people are scared of wild animals, and there is also the environmental hygiene problems caused by them. But if we just use the law, it may cause other problems. Well, what we have in mind is that everything is equal and we can peacefully coexist with animals. But what about public education, especially for young children? If there is a wild animal that's hurt and someone wants to help them, what are you supposed to do? Or is it the case that you can't handle wild animals in any way? It may have an impact on our younger generation. I don't want to give the wrong impression because we do need to exist in harmony with wild animals. Another concern of mine is the image of Hong Kong in the international community. In other places, they accept feeding of a dozen pigeons. I do understand that the droppings of wild pigeons causes problem, but can we strike a balance? If it's an across-the-board ban on all wild animals, I'm concerned that there may be a negative impact on education, in particular young children. Acting Assistant Director, I thank Reverend Kuhn for his question. Education is a concern of ours. We've been doing a lot of public education and publicity activities to teach members of the public how to correctly handle wild animals. Feeding of wild animals causes a lot of problems because they're supposed to forage in the wild. And if they're used to being fed by human beings, then they will suffer in many different ways, say, for example, their health. So we do carry out publicity and public education as to how to coexist with wild animals. You should not feed them. They should find food themselves. Well, feeding domesticated animals or pets different because they rely on human beings to feed them, so that's entirely different. Feeding pigeons. That is actually a problem for many different places in the world. Here in Hong Kong, members of the public has expressed concerns about nuisance caused by feeding of wild pigeons. We do need to strike a balance, so we will address the problem. In the future, we will include feeding of wild pigeons under the prohibition. It's not just about environmental hygiene. Feeding by human beings would cause an unnatural reproduction of the wild pigeon population, and the food you give them are not entirely natural. Thank you. Members have asked all the questions in the first round. There are 2 members who would like to ask their questions in the second round. I will give them 4 minutes question and answers included. First, Mr. Chan Hock Fong. I'm glad to hear from the administration that there is a timetable to tackle wild pigeons. That is before the end of next year. The chairperson asked about manpower deployment. When it comes to wild pigeons, you will need a huge amount of manpower to take law enforcement action. Back to my question of making use of technology. CCTV, if you can make use of that, it will greatly reduce the need to rely on manpower. Making use of technology to take law enforcement action, would you give us a comprehensive plan next year? Well, with the inclusion of wild pigeons, you will also include the use of CCTV or technology to enable law enforcement action. So I would like to know about the timetable of the use of CCTV to take law enforcement actions. Well, currently, if you're feeding animals in a country park, I think there are no domesticated animals apart from stray cats and dogs. So if you spot someone feeding animals in a country park, can you use this law to take action? A country park's different from urban areas. Would the level of evidence required be different? So there are 2 questions. Thank you. I thank Mr. Chan for the questions. The use of CCTV and technology in law enforcement actions. We'll talk to the Department of Justice. We'll look into it to see whether it is appropriate or suitable to use CCTV, that is video footage or technology in our law enforcement action, and whether it is feasible. We'll talk to the DOJ. Yes, that is the case for country parks. When someone feeds animals in country parks, I think they're feeding wild animals is easier to prove our case. The amendment notice will cover country parks as well. So if there is illegal feeding in country parks, we're talking about, under the amendment notice, country parks as well. Next, Mr. Dennis Leung. Thank you, Chairman. This is a belated exercise, and in 2019, in relation to a proposal of regulating feeding of wild animals, there is a proposal of expansion of feeding banned area under Cap 170. Under interpretation, wild animals include any animal other than those classed as common law as domestic, including those so classed which have gone astray or have been abandoned. So, under the common law, I don't find any information as to what are classed as domesticated. From the information, domesticated animal means cats and dogs, pets, and animals for food, say cows, hamsters, rabbits. And there is information about domesticated animals. If they are not trained, if they are not owned, they may go wild again. So if there is no clear definition of domesticated animals, it's very difficult for members of the public to abide by the law. If you're only talking about wild pigeons being fed, does it mean that they can be domesticated? The fact that they're being fed doesn't mean that they're domesticated. These are wild pigeons. You can't treat them as domesticated. Those have been released back into the wild are wild animals. You need to have a clear definition for people to abide by the law. So, what are domesticated animals? Director, I think it's back to the same question. The law says that animal animals other than those classed as common law as domestic. So it's not just about cats and dogs. We're talking about pigeons or wild pigeons. They are poultry. If you release them in the wild, they are still classified as domesticated animals, not wild animals. Well, it's easy to tell. Poultry are domesticated animals, others are wild animals. I do not agree with the explanation given by the administration. In 1997, at the reunification, we have released about 10,000 doves. So are they domesticated animals? So you have to give us a list as to what domesticated animals are. Otherwise, we'll get bogged down in what domesticated animals are. If you enhance the penalty, but if it is not imposed by the court, if the court just imposes a fine of 5,000 or 1,000, then it doesn't really matter how high you have increased the penalty. How do you make sure that the court will impose a deterrent level of fine? I think that is crucial.
多謝梁議員。
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Member, for the question. How can we make it clear which animals are domesticated animals and which are wild animals? We can cover this in our publicity efforts to educate citizens on the meaning of domesticated and wild animals in Hong Kong. In simple terms, cats, dogs, pigeons, cows are domesticated animals, whether they are strayed or not, they are still domesticated animals. When it comes to penalty, In general, illegal feeding in feeding ban area attracts a maximum fine of $10,000, but in general, courts will only impose a fine below $1,000, and we would propose increasing the penalty. Our plan right now is to increase the penalty to $100,000 and imprisonment of 1 year next year. Then we can increase the penalty for illegal feeding. If, however, we use the fixed penalty, we would propose $5,000. So there is no room for argument. Whenever someone feeds animals illegally, this will attract a fine of $5,000. Summonses will also be used, and the fine is up to $100,000 and an imprisonment of 1 year. We have already expressed our views in relation to the policy, and there are also explanations offered by the administration. And let us move on to the scrutiny of the provisions. And let us start the clause-by-clause scrutiny right now. We are now scrutinizing the Prohibition of Feeding of Wild Animals Notice, 1999 Amendment Notice 2022. We aim to amend Wild Animals Protection Ordinance, Cap 170, Subsidiary Legislation B, that is to say, Prohibition of Feeding of Wild Animals Notice 1999. And we propose to expand the feeding ban area to the entire territory of Hong Kong. I will now read the amendments. The title is to repeal 1999 at the title and repeal area described in the schedule are specified as places replaced by entire Hong Kong Special Administrative Region is specified as a place. And we also propose repealing the schedule. This is a simple amendment. Is there any comment from members? Without comments, we will invite the legal advisor of our subcommittee, Mr. Tony Tse. Of course, the amendments seem simple. As I have already mentioned, the date it will come into operation is the 31st of December this year. As mentioned, an fixed penalty will be introduced, and this covers all wild animals, despite the fact that some members mention the legal definition, and the existing legal definition will be employed in the implementation of this ordinance. Although this ordinance will, that is to say, the amendments will come into operation on the 31st of December, the remaining amendments will take effect by the end of next year. The closer these two happen, the amendments will become more effective, and I hope the government can expedite the work in this regard. When it comes to wild animals, that is to say wild pigs, monkeys, pigeons, etc., I think the government should expedite the work because we have been discussing all these for a long time. Despite a wide coverage, the effect is still limited. You are playing safe today, you are saying by the end of next year, but then I still hope that we can expedite our work. Otherwise, the effect will not be very effective. Otherwise, you will also come into different problems when you implement the ordinance after amendments, that is to say, after the expansion of the feeding ban area to the entire territory of Hong Kong. and I believe that the administration has already received all these comments. Is there any difficulty that has been identified in relation to the amendments? I confirm that there is no difficulty identified. Do members think that we need to invite the public to write submissions, written submissions, in relation to this amendment? If there is a need to do so, the Secretariat will arrange for a notice to be put on the website of Ecology so that the public can submit written submissions in relation to these amendments. So we will invite the public to submit written submissions to air their views. And now the legislative timetable. And please pay attention to the following timetable. The expiry date of the scrutiny period is the 7th of December 2022, and the report to the House Committee is the 25th of November 2022. The period of giving notice of amendments to the subsidiary legislation is the 30th of November 2022. Should the scrutiny period be extended by resolution, the expiry date will be the 11th of January 2023. The report to the House Committee will be the 9th of December 2022, and the period of giving notice of amendments to the subsidiary legislation will be the 4th of January 2023. The subcommittee will report its work to the House Committee prior to the expiry date of the scrutiny period. With members agreeing, I will move a motion in the Council meeting on the 30th of November 2022. That is to say, the scrutiny period will be extended to the 11th of January 2023. And this is the procedural matter I'd like to report to members. Without other comments, we will call it a day. We have finished scrutinizing this ordinance. The Secretariat has reminded me just now that we will invite the public to submit written submissions. Afterwards, we can peruse the submissions, and if need be, we can convene the next meeting. Otherwise, we have already completed our work with the subcommittee. Basically, we have already finished our work today. And there is no other business today. We will inform you in due course when we have received written submissions. Thank you, members. Thank you.